Bonjour.
Hello, order everyone. Hello and welcome to the 26th meeting of the Common Standings Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs.
Territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. Aujourd'hui, on continue.
Today we are continuing on our fourth study on the Arctic sovereignty, security, and emergency preparedness of Indigenous peoples in the Arctic.
We will be hearing from Professor Christian Luprecht, Royal Military College of Canada, in person, Mr. Calvin Peterson, volunteer with the Kugluktuk Search and Rescue Operation, also in person. And from the Red Cross, we have Sarah Sargent, Vice President, Programs Emergency Management of the Canadian Red Cross, as well as Shelley Cardinal, Director of Indigenous Relations with the Canadian Red Cross. Je voudrais vous rappeler.
I would like to remind you of the rules of internal economy concerning physical distancing and masks.
I would like to outline a few rules to follow. Members or witnesses may speak in the official language of their choice. Interpretation services in English, French, and Inuktitut are available for today's meeting. Please be patient with the interpretation. There may be a delay, especially since the Inuktitut has to be translated into English first before it can be translated into French and vice versa. The interpretation button is found at the bottom of your screen if you're in virtual, in either English, French, or Inuktitut. If interpretation is lost, please inform me immediately. We'll stop the proceedings and fix the problem. The raise hand feature at the bottom of the screen can be used at any time if you wish to speak or alert the chair. Before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. And if you are on the video conference, please click on the microphone icon to unmute yourself. Those in the room, your microphone will be controlled as per normal by the Proceedings and Verification Officer. When speaking, I would ask you to speak slowly and clearly to help the interpreters. And when you are not speaking, please put your mic on mute. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. As with all of our meetings where we invite witnesses, each witness will have 5 minutes for opening remarks. I would ask you to stick to those 5 minutes, and that will be followed by a question period. So without further ado, we will start our proceedings, and I would ask Professor Christian Luprecht to start us off. Professor.
Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. Je vais intervenir en anglais.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I will be speaking in English, but you can ask me questions in the language of your choice.
Thinking on environmental security and the role of the military in the American and Canadian Arctic has identified vulnerabilities of communities and Canadian sovereignty in light of capacity to respond to large-scale civilian disasters. Much of the training and focus is conducted by agencies and organizations other than the Canadian Armed Forces, including civilian academics and American security agencies. A recent CAF paper suggested that climate change will precipitate varying degrees of unprecedented activity in the north, with the CAF having to prepare to defend Canada's interests. This understanding of the importance of the armed forces' response to civilian disasters is arguably more developed in Canada's north than it is in its more southern military culture. Based on Canada's experience with wildfires and climate change, particularly in northern and remote communities, assessments of security and safety over the past decade foresee a rise in challenges that require an integrated CAF response as part of a more comprehensive approach. The Chief of Force Development notes successfully implementing government policy in the north will mean setting the conditions for human safety and security as increasing economic development takes place. However, the Canadian Armed Forces has a distinctly ambiguous attitude towards domestic deployment. They have no plans to develop specialized units or military occupations to deal with humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. On the one hand, the CAF seems quite content in the belief that general-purpose combat training provides all the capacity that's required. On the other hand, the armed services seem to believe that humanitarian relief and domestic missions threaten their combat role. There is little factual basis for this belief, While there have been large recent demands for assistance because of wildfires and flooding, as well as the pandemic, demands have been even greater in the past. Requests for assistance have grown in number, but they've required only minor quantities of resources for shorter period of time. We can sense a shift in thinking, even by the current Chief of Defence Staff, who in October 21 stated that although it was an essential function of the CAF to defend the country, that the pressure of domestic humanitarian and relief operations had made it necessary to redefine defend. He held open the role of the reserves and the possibility that Canada needed troops dedicated to civil defence. The Army Reserve maintains 10 domestic response companies and 4 Arctic response groups. This component, however, is plagued by high turnover, inability to reach training standards, and is available only on a case-by-case volunteer basis. So there are limits to how far the armed services can go in assigning a core policy role to the primary reserves without the government first addressing reserve problems with job security and availability. The armed services need to ask themselves whether a core role can be left without a permanent formation and occupational structure. My submission then walks through how, among the 8 tasks for the Canadian Armed Forces, the 2 that are left without a permanent force structure are assistance to civil authorities for law enforcement and the provision of assistance to civil authorities and non-governmental partners in responding to international and domestic disasters and major emergencies, which are dependent on retasking forces designed for combat or combat support, as in the case of the company-sized disaster resistance assistance response team. So in the short term, the best option may be for the federal government to reprioritize, along with a slight formal expansion of the CAF, to support its domestic role, create a combined capability of about 2,000 regulars, concentrated on the Royal Canadian Air Force, which provides much of the regular force capability, and reserve soldiers with an important ranger component to focus on improving infrastructure in remote First Nations communities. Some Indigenous communities have gone on record to observe a fundamental need to engage in disaster response training that could be delivered as part of this liaison process. This combined force would spend most of the year liaising, planning, and preparing to deploy to northern communities in the summer, but that could be postponed or rescheduled if they were called out to a flood or to a wildfire instead. Such a dedicated domestic role has precedent. In the 1920s and 1930s and the post-war period, the Royal Canadian Air Force was tasked with mapping and charting Canada. And during this process, the Royal Canadian Air Force generated skills and planes for bush pilots.
Thank you, Professor Luprecht. We'll now ask Mr. Calvin Peterson to give his opening remarks. Mr. Peterson, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Calvin Peterson, and I'm a longtime search and rescue or SAR volunteer in Cambridge Bay and Coglocto, a former MLA for my community and a Canadian Ranger for 22 years. I've traveled approximately 250,000 miles on snowmobile, ATV, boat, and on foot in my lifetime. Currently, I serve as a volunteer with Coglocto Search and Rescue. We have a ground SAR team and a Coast Guard auxiliary unit, although it's generally the same people in both. Through the dedication of all our volunteer responders, we conduct SAR operations year-round. But we are a small community with a small volunteer pool, which means that most of our members wear many hats. Some are GSAR, Coast Guard, Volunteer Fire, and Canadian Rangers. Look at Jack Himer, our coordinator. He does all of the administration, the paperwork. He leads the fundraising, manages all ground and marine searches alongside his full-time job. Each community is extremely lucky to have a jack of all trades, if you will, along with dedicated individuals to help when the time comes. But volunteer burnout is a real problem, and it is made worse by a heavy caseload that is only increasing. A lack of training, equipment, funding, and no mental health supports for responders. And we almost always know the people we are searching for or the bodies we are recovering. We also have to deal with slow response times from southern-based SAR assets and this is true for all emergency and disaster events in our communities. Outside help is always hours or days away. Communities must be prepared to go it alone for extended periods. The Northwest Passage is getting busier, and increased traffic equals increased emergencies. This includes small pleasure craft like that New Zealand sailing boat that was first spotted by Inuit Marine Monitor Bobby Klinkenberg of Cambridge Bay in 2020. These greenhorns will almost certainly add to our SAR workload. This traffic includes cruise ships with hundreds on board. If a cruise ship ran aground near our community, we would be the first responders and they'd be offloaded into our community. But do we have the capacity? What if they ate all of the food in the community? Or the rescue sucks up all of our fuel? What if they are injured? We don't even have enough medical assistance for our own community members. This is a big worry. So there are many SAR and emergency management challenges to overcome. Would federal SAR assets based in the region, particularly aircraft, help? Sure. But emergencies are always local. We need to build capabilities and resilience from the ground up. I am a lead researcher on the Kitamute Search and Rescue Project, working with community responders and academics Peter Keckert and Whitlin Lackenbauer to better understand the challenges we face and develop possible solutions. Our work has generated several cost-effective solutions that we think would make a big difference. First off, establish a permanent Inuit Nunangat or Northern Search and Rescue Roundtable that would bring community responders together with territorial and federal practitioners to work through the challenges and plan for complex scenarios like a mass rescue operation in the Northwest Passage. Inuit already feel responsible for these waters, so give us some responsibility for the planning. Second, we need greater support for preventative search and rescue activities, including land safety courses and wilderness first aid built into the educational curriculum, which I had when I was young. Let's bring these courses back. They will decrease the number of searches for community members. Third, our community responders need sustained funding and support. These groups save lives while also providing the safety net we need to move, live, and work safely on the land, water, and ice. These groups support Canada's wider aims. Better protection of the passage by Inuit groups would show that we are here, we live here, and these are Canadian waters. Finally, we believe it is time for the establishment of a community public safety officer program in Nunavut and across Inuit Nunangat. This program would provide communities with full-time public safety officers responsible for SAR prevention, preparation, response, and all hazards emergency management. And emergency medical services. Such a program would build off the local knowledge, Inuit Koimayatukang and community relationships with officers, while providing the space for the development of new capabilities. They could lead the land safety classes in schools, make sure emergency plans aren't just gathering dust on the shelf, train volunteers, coordinate searches, conduct debriefings, drive the ambulance, work the private industry, and perform a wide range of other emergency tasks. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. We'll now invite our guests from the Canadian Red Cross for a 5-minute opening statement. I'm assuming it's Ms. Sargent, but of course you can share your time. You have 5 minutes. I believe you're muted, Ms. Sargent.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Shelley Cardinal, and I'm the Director of Indigenous Relations at the Canadian Red Cross. I am joined today by my colleague Sarah Sargent, Vice President of Programs, Canadian Operations. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I am Cree First Nations and joining from the Lekwungen-speaking Peoples Territory. I also want to acknowledge the land in which my colleague Sarah Sargent is currently situated and where this testimony is being heard in the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. The Canadian Red Cross has a long history working alongside Indigenous communities, having worked with close to 800 communities over 30 years. Each year, with increasing frequency and severity, we are seeing the growing impact of climate change on Canadian soil, particularly in Indigenous and Northern communities. As we speak, the Red Cross is supporting the Peguis First Nation in Manitoba that has once again been threatened by spring flooding, forcing more than 1,800 residents to be evacuated. In recent years, we have embarked on unprecedented growth and expansion in our work with Indigenous peoples. On average, the Red Cross now stewards over 500 relationships with Indigenous communities each year. At the Red Cross, we believe the time has come to stop treating large-scale events as exceptional. We also believe that we must expand our view on security to include both catastrophic climate events and other crises, including social emergencies and social crises. These events often intersect with one another and threaten the security of individuals, families, and communities. This includes precarious housing, food insecurity, displacement, increased violence, and inadequate health and psychosocial services. Adequate tools, response, and recovery systems are needed to address these realities. Indigenous peoples are the most exposed to the effects of climate change, yet have the fewest resources to adapt and mitigate to its impacts. Northern communities in particular are witnessing significant changes to their environment, which are affecting their health, livelihoods, and safety. Our recommendations to support Indigenous and Northern communities, reduce risk, prepare for and respond to climate-driven disasters and social emergencies, the Red Cross recommends the following actions be taken. The first, that the Government of Canada ensures cultural safety is embedded in each strategic planning, policy, and program, design, and delivery. As traditional stewards and caretakers of their land, we need to make space for Indigenous worldviews and traditional practices that have guided their communities since time immemorial and fully understand historical harm and the impacts of trauma. A holistic view of a crisis is rooted in cultural safety. Cultural safety also recognizes the inherent right to self-determination for Indigenous peoples, as communities can identify what is important to for their security and protection and preservation of cultural practices. Our experience supporting communities has shown that responding to disasters and emergencies, particularly social emergencies, in a culturally safe way is vital. Recommendation 2, that the Government of Canada better support Indigenous leaders in preparedness, risk reduction, including adaptation and response activities to climate-driven disasters and social emergencies. This includes programming to create readiness capacity and contribute to prevention education, as well as more investment in Indigenous innovation, research and development in disaster response and recovery efforts, as well as risk reduction and adaptation in order to support communities develop their infrastructure to respond effectively and recover. Part of the Canadian Red Cross's mandate is to support Indigenous leaders both in responding to disaster and reducing risk by building local capacity for emergency preparedness in a culturally safe way. For example, with the support of Indigenous Services Canada, the Red Cross launched the Indigenous Help Desk for Indigenous leaders in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, providing critical resource information and referrals, as well as one-on-one guidance to Indigenous leaders virtually. This program continues to provide risk reduction support in response to climate-driven disasters. Recognizing Indigenous rights and inclusive of community input at all times, the Red Cross and the Assembly of First Nations have established a relationship protocol to undertake joint efforts in the development of strategies and initiatives intended to advance and improve First Nations quality of life and well-being in accordance with the Red Cross mandate to alleviate human suffering. It is critical that responders reflect the communities they serve and support. The Red Cross is actively working to increase representation and Indigenous personnel across our organization. At the Help Desk, we provide services in 8 different Indigenous languages, and 80% of our virtual responders identify as Indigenous. Our recommendation 3, in an increasing digital world and learning from the success of COVID-19 virtual interventions, that the Government of Canada invest in virtual programming and improve digital infrastructure for Indigenous and Northern communities to ensure that humanitarian organizations like the Canadian Red Cross can provide critical prevention, risk reduction, and response services virtually. Barriers to digital infrastructure means that limited connectivity is impacting the ability to respond to emergencies and contribute towards disaster, crisis, and emergency prevention efforts virtually. Virtual tools are an important component in emergency management efforts. For example, to help and prevent the spread of COVID-19, the Red Cross was able to support epidemic prevention and control measures using virtual walkthroughs and provide guidance through virtual Q&As. We also respond to social emergencies through online psychological first aid training and other virtual supports. To support the growing relationship in Indigenous communities across Canada, and particularly in the North, and be able to provide effective prevention, risk reduction, and response activities, virtual support is essential. Our partnership with nations across Turtle Island have...
Ms. Cardinal, I'm going to have to ask you to wrap up so we can get to questions.
Okay. As our partnerships with nations across Turtle Island have made it clear that the responsibility for reconciliation lies with the government and their partners, and accountability needs to be tied to communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cardinal. We'll now go to the first round of questions, and I have Mr. Viersen up for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to thank the honorable witnesses for joining us here today. Calvin, I want to thank you for all your service there in the North, for sure. And Christian, I was wondering if I'd start with you. I was just wondering if you could give us an assessment of perhaps, particularly given we are neighbors with Russia, despite us not necessarily thinking about it. Do you have any expertise or opinions around what the threat is and how prepared the Russians are on their northern border compared to us?
So my friend and colleague Rob Hubert, who you probably know, will be able to provide you with a much more detailed breakdown than I'll be able to. But certainly, I would say one of the challenges in the north is that Russia as an adversary currently has the initiative. And so we need to think about how we can regain the initiative. And I think everything you've heard here from the various witnesses are ways of us regaining the initiative rather than being on our back foot, and being proactive in how we invest strategically to advance both our national security objectives but also our human security objectives. Because I think if you ask Northern community what their understanding of security is, it is very different from our Southern understanding or from your and my understanding, focused around issues of food security, for instance. So I think we can reconcile these with the various interventions that you've heard here, while at the same time being more proactive in deterring and containing the initiative of our adversaries, in particular Russia. But I will also remind you that, of course, as you know, China has been quite active in our Arctic domain.
My next question was around China, and I guess, do you have like any specific examples of what Russia is doing in the north that we should be aware of?
So Russia has made significant investments in the north. It appears that Russia is for now done with the investments that they have provided, in particular in resuscitating significant amounts of Soviet capabilities and installations, as well as a more significant forward deployment of resources. Some of the concerns should be also of interest to this committee, where Russia has essentially decided that the northern passage around Russia, that is technically international waters, Russia now requires Russian ships to accompany any ships that use that northern passage, and is charging fees for that privilege. And so I think this again sort of shows that there is a disregard by our adversaries for international norms and international law when it comes to how we manage these very challenging as well as scarce resources in the north. And so Canada needs to, I think, double down on making sure that it has the capacity to insist on the commonly agreed upon norms, conventions, and legal imperatives, because those will have adverse effects on local communities when they are not being adhered to.
Just now switching to China, could you give us a fairly concrete example on what China is doing in the area?
Considerable concern about China is resource exploitation, both fishing resource exploitation and potential other natural resource exploitation in international waters in the north. And as we know, these Arctic and Antarctic ecosystems are extremely fragile. So if you disturb them, we know what the consequences were when fish stocks collapsed in other parts of the countries. If we have active overfishing or other resource exploitation that is not extremely carefully managed, then this will have for decades adverse consequences for the ability of local communities to sustain their lifestyle and sustain their culture. And so this is why it is important for us to have both surveillance capacity as well as intervention capacity if we believe that outsiders are engaged in activity that is not commensurate with our interests or with international agreements or international law, and the ability to be able to enforce those. And we can't always rely on our U.S. neighbor because, as we know, their resources, their security resources are in very high demand these days. So we need to make sure that we have our own assets and capabilities to assert our interests and the interests of our northern co-citizens.
In terms of the natural gas and oil reserves in the north, do you see China trying to access any of that?
Well, we have already seen China aggressively attempting to invest in mining capacity in northern Canada in ways that triggered national security concerns by the federal government. So I think we have concrete evidence that China is not just actively eyeing, but actively trying to find mechanisms by which it can access our natural resources. And of course, Canada having $3 trillion natural resource industries, oil, gas, as well as agriculture, and among the tiny number of countries that has 3 such natural resource wealth, we must be prepared for the fact that China will aggressively attempt to access all 3 of those resources.
Do you got any clear recommendation around how to combat that?
Certainly, any investment that we are able to make in the north is significant. What we need to keep in mind, what is often forgotten, and my colleagues here can speak to this, is that to do anything in the north is about 10 times as expensive as it is to do in the south, because of the challenges around infrastructure, because of the challenge around skills and so forth. And so I think we don't take that into account when we allocate budgets, whether that is for military training, whether that is for rangers, or whether when we engage in northern development. And those costs are going to rise with the rapid impacts that climate change are having on a rapidly shifting geography in the north. And with the limited resources that Canada has as a huge country with a tiny tax base, we need to be very strategic about how we invest those resources to ensure that I think we advance both our security interests as well as northern development.
Thank you, Mr. Viersen. Ms. Satwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses today for joining us, especially Mr. Peterson for the long trek to get here. You mentioned about some of the burnout that occurs with volunteers, and already with such a small pool to draw from. Are there any, mitigation efforts or supports that exist or that you would like to see exist to help support volunteers for search and rescue?
Right now, there's very little support for everybody, and I would like to see a lot more support. Like I said earlier, we most often know these people that we're searching for or the bodies who are recovering, and we're pretty much left on our own to deal with things afterwards. And to have someone professionally help us out, that would mean a lot. It would do a lot for the community members and for the search and rescue volunteers. I mean, we don't even do debriefs afterwards. We go home and we do our own thing, and you know, that's a lot of these guys are very strong and capable of doing this. I think that's why there's a very small volunteer pool. It takes a different kind of person to do this. I mean, imagine looking for somebody that you've known all your life and you find a body. That's very hard on a person, and then you go home and then you're just left alone to deal with it in your own ways. So to have professional help, that would mean a whole lot to the whole North, yes.
Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you very much. You mentioned a lot of long-term and short-term goals as far as kind of ameliorating the situation, and you mentioned preventative education, which I think you're the first witness to bring that forward, and I'd like you to kind of touch more base on that, and if you could kind of expand on what kind of education programs would be the most beneficial to deploy to try to be more preventative.
I think I was part of the last groups I think I was in grade school. We actually received firearm safety training in school, in class. And I also got wilderness first aid, and there was a outdoor leadership program that one of my teachers spearheaded, and that was great. I think that I can owe a lot of my skills to that, and that helped me a lot in my 250,000 miles I've put on so far. And the earlier we teach the children, the better. I mean, they can take that knowledge and run with it and work with each other. So yeah, start early is just the best. I mean, you have schools here that teach driver education. Just as important to have firearms education in the North as driver's education here. It's just as important, I believe. Thank you.
Thank you. And what role would provincial and territorial governments have in some of these initiatives as well? Again, on some of those long-term and short-term goals.
I think funding would be a huge part. I mean, right now, a lot of the funding comes from just local fundraising, local efforts, and donations. We did have local mines in the area providing a lot of money, but they're drying up and those mines are shutting down. So to have support from provincial, territorial would be great. I mean, we are basically doing this on our own. We do a good job, but imagine what we can do with help. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a question to Ms. Cardinal. So we've had some witnesses testify about kind of the evacuation process and what that, I'd like to know what that looks like from your side. Can you walk us through the process when the Red Cross is engaged to help support a community, and what, if there are timelines, the communication mechanisms, are there distances considered as far as how far you're taking community members away to an evacuation place? Just some clarity around some of the processes once you're engaged.
Sarah, can I actually have you start?
Sure. No, thank you very much, and thank you for the question. Really, the dependencies on how fast we can respond, what that response looks like, where is the evacuation location, is very much dependent on the location of the disaster itself, which communities have the capacity to support communities in a safe way, and the recognition of the scale and scope of the event. And so I think it's really, looking at what are the standards in terms of receiving requests for evacuations, putting in place, having conversations with community leadership, as well as the authorities and the responsibility holders on how are we going to make decisions. If we have a community that is displaced, how do we make decisions on where they will be located, the type of housing and accommodation provided, who are the partner organizations. I think one of the things we're really trying to recognize in an evacuation approach is that we need to do work at the forefront. How are we building those relationships with communities at risk? How are we understanding the natural support structures who provide services in times outside of disaster? How are we looking at what are the needs and requirements that are distinct for that population that we need to maintain and continue in evacuation? And so there's many different parameters, but I think the the key message I would like to bring is what are we doing beforehand? How are we, looking at the prevention of the evacuation in the first place? Many times communities have to evacuate because they don't have access to the right materials and capacities to shelter in place. And we know that in many cases, this is a first choice. So are there ways, is there investment we can be making to build that capacity in communities so that they can stay safe? And really using evacuation as a last resort. And I really hope that as we talk about prevention, as we talk about the recognition that these events are only going to continue to grow in scale and uncertainty, how can we be looking at new ways of working together?
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Atwin. We're going to go to our next speaker. Madame Gill, vous avez 6 minutes.
Madame Gill, you have 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to thank the witnesses that are here with us today. I have a few questions, Mr. Chair, for Mr. Larson, because I think it's interesting what he's told us. His testimony really is telling us about the reality in the field. I'd like to know if he could explain to us, to give us some concrete examples of how his community has to deal with, when we talk about any kind of crisis, what kind of crisis, if he could explain the types of situations he deals with. And also he says I'd like to know if his community has been consulted as to the needs, and then I'll continue with the rest of my question, Mr. Chair.
Do you want some examples of what, sorry?
Of the kind of search and rescue operations.
Mr. Chair, yes, if I could. Yes, I'd like to know concretely what type of situations your community has to deal with. If you could describe all types of situations that you deal with.
I believe the most important search and rescues happen within the shoulder seasons. Like right now, there's people at home, both snowmobile and boating. That will create problems for searches in the fact that who goes to search? If I have to go by boat and snowmobile, whose responsibility is it? GSAR, Coast Guard, both? Who do I call? Who calls the shots? But yeah, shoulder seasons are very, very hard to deal with because we do have a lack of equipment and a lack of proper safety gear. But the midwinter and midsummer are a little easier to deal with because it's simply just one vehicle, one type of vehicle, and you can head out and hopefully find the person you're looking for. I hope that's what you were seeking. Thanks.
Well, I wanted to get an idea a little bit broader. As you mentioned, in your communities, you have to wear every hat. So you live there, but at the same time, you're always the first responders. So I'd like to know what other type of situations, what of crisis that you do have to deal with or that you might have to deal with.
A few years ago, a ship actually did run aground about, I think, 50 miles from our community. And we were the first responders, I believe. And for us to go there with our little tiny boats and to help out this ship full of people, I mean, we need more resources. And how many little boats do you think it would take to offload a ship? That's a whole lot. I'm not sure if our community has enough boats if we do get a big cruise ship. So there has been examples in the past of ships actually running aground and us having to go help them out. Other examples would be more local. I mean, we do have community members like myself that travel very far, sometimes hundreds of miles. But lately, in this day and age, we do have InReach, we do have spot devices, things like that that'll assist, but not everybody has that, so yeah.
Have you, Mr. Chair, I'd like to ask if his community has been consulted with to see what the needs are to be able to respond when there's a search and rescue operations?
As far as I know, no, we haven't.
At this point, I know that you have different solutions. I may not have the time to ask all my questions, but if you have any other notes that you would like to provide, I think it would be nice if you could explain just how a round table would work to consult with you and what the objectives would be. If you could please help us out with that information for our recommendations.
A round table would benefit us a lot because more heads equals more solutions, right? More the diversity of people getting together and coming up with ideas. It just generates a lot more progress, I guess. I hope that's what you're looking for. Yeah, more heads equals better solutions, I think.
Do I still have time, Mr. Chair? You have 40 seconds. Well, maybe if you could suggest to people who would be the ones that should participate in the round table, and what type of financial aid, and what if you would have the Coast Guard, who would be the different people participating in this round table, what you would like to see?
The Coast Guard, GSAR, federal, territorial representatives all get together and sit down and hash out things like solutions. Like I said earlier, the more heads that get together on this, the better results we may get for the people that we are actually looking for, the people who are trying to save. I mean, when we're on searches, every second counts, absolutely every second counts. And if we couldn't all meet together and reduce by 10, 15, 20 seconds even, it will save lives.
Merci, Madame Gill.
Thank you very much, Madame Gill.
Kaya na me iksibautak sivulang me tamase tunga subtit tumabase onikariak to saktose aksuero to sangnok tuin naugase pimmagerong ne okausak tuin no dosiglo amaro aprilangin ng net Calvin mo apirinagama ikaitit yamatuin naktunga malikaliak tagjuango katika elekse tana Calvin ikaitit kanekudlogo. So
Madam, we're not getting a translation at the moment. Could we check into that, please? And I'll start your clock over.
Thank you.
I'm in the English channel. I'm fine. I believe I can continue now. Thank you. First of all, for those of you that are here to give a presentation, thank you very much. Your presentations are very interesting. And I would like to remind the other members of Parliament to remember Calvin. We will be going to Koloktok, to his hometown. We will need Calvin when we get there. We will meet him. He will, of course, be able to help us when we come to your community for a meeting. Calvin, I have a question for you. Could you describe to me the importance of the Canadian Rangers program for the Arctic, along with their work of search and rescue? How important is that?
They are very important. The Canadian Rangers and both the search and rescue are our lifeline, really. I mean, they're the people there on the ground, ready at a moment's notice when anything happens. Search and rescue will be, no doubt, be ready a little faster than the Canadian Rangers, just because of logistics, I guess, and paperwork and permissions, that kind of thing. But without these, the Canadian Rangers and search and rescue, I don't know where we would be. The stats would be a lot higher for loss of life, things like that. But yeah, they're very important for the North in each community.
Okay.
Thank you. Second question I have for you, Calvin. Please describe to me the role of the Canadian Rangers in advancing reconciliation in Canada, in reconciliation with the Aboriginal peoples in Canada.
Canadian Rangers, we're on the ground. We live here. We are from here. We know the land. We know the people. We know the history, and that's priceless in any situation. If you ask me to search here, I can be of great help, but I'm not from here. I don't know the land. I don't know anything here, really. I'm lost here. like trees, to have local knowledge and expertise is a huge difference. It will make a difference in saving people's lives in a timely manner. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I believe they are extremely important to the North.
Okay.
Thank you again. If I have more time, another question. When you gave your report, you mentioned certain recommendations to improve services. If the recommendations you are proposing were to be carried through and implemented, and if you have trouble getting those implemented and heard, how does it affect the current work you do?
Loss of life. We do our best right now. We do save lives. We have been for a number of years, but to not have any help would be kind of disastrous, I think, in my eyes. I mean, to lose one life is too much. And if all it takes is a few dollars and a little bit of time and some people getting together, then let's do it. That's all it takes. I mean, if it takes just that to save one life, let's do it. Hey, where's my card? If that's all it takes, then yes. If we don't get it in, then we will continue to do this like we have been for years. But we will struggle. I mean, we don't have the proper safety gear. We don't have the proper equipment. All we use basically is our own gear. I mean, we don't even have like diving teams or what do you call them? Those wetsuits, the dry suits to go for this time of year. Those safety equipment would be awesome to have. Basically, we go out there and we go out with our snowmobile, our sled, and that's about it. Or the sled box becomes the stretcher, right? We don't have the proper gear to properly save lives or specialized equipment. If we had a hovercraft to help us out, like right now at home, there's people both snowmobile and boating. I can take a picture from my parents' house with a boat here and about 2 miles back, a snowmobile. So, yeah, we face a lot of challenges, and we need the help. We need the finances. We need the territorial and provincial government to come in and help us. Like, we've been doing okay up until now, but we can save a lot more lives if we do have the proper gear.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sidlaut. We'll go to a quick second round. We'll start with Mr. Shields. Mr. Shields, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Quickly to Professor, you mentioned a very specific number in military. You talked about 2,000. How would you see that deployed?
So when the Canadian Armed Forces go on domestic operations, there's three demands that tend to show up. General labor, expert capacity, so we saw this during the pandemic, health serve, and lift capacity, so Air Force. So this is why on the military side, you need a particular, I think, the Air Force needs to be heavily represented. So I think about 1,000 regular forces and about 1,000 reserves with an important ranger component. And so, for instance, you heard mention here of community safety officers. So I can see all those folks being integrated into this permanent force, because not everybody needs to be at NDHQ here in Ottawa, right? To the contrary, you want a distributed force that is nonetheless able to plan. You heard about the roundtable. What does the roundtable do? The same problem that we have here in Ottawa. When we invoke the Federal Emergency Response Plan, half the people around the table have no idea what the plan is or how you actually make it work. So you actually get people around the table. You practice this. You practice some of the larger emergencies, so that when people have to work together, you have the communities and you have the people who've all gotten to know each other. They've done the tabletop exercises and they know how to roll things out. And this is how you hear how saving a few minutes here or there, this is what it comes down to in terms of these tabletop exercises. So I think this is why a permanent structure, the challenges that you heard outlined, they will continue to grow with climate change because the land is changing rapidly. So if you have a permanent forest structure, you now have people who can actively, permanently dedicate their efforts to that. And if you look at the 8 missions of the Canadian Armed Forces, 5 of them are international missions, 3 of them are domestic. We have dedicated force structure for search and rescue. Why do we not have dedicated force structure, for instance, for domestic operations, emergency response? Are the lives of Northerners not as important as our commitment to UN, NATO, and other types of international operations?
What you're suggesting, Alert Bay, is not the answer. The tabletop exercises and the plans that we talk about, having been involved in many tabletops, developed many plans, and if you go into many places, I still get a pile of dust off them. So how critical is it to that tabletop exercise?
Well, I think what we heard here is the tabletop exercise can allow us, for instance, this is also stakeholder and community engagement. It allows us to identify what are the items that are missing locally. And yes, we can't provide all the equipment in one go, but we can actually develop a plan. And chances are for different communities, it'll be different items that the local communities will tell you, this is what we urgently need in our neighborhood. And if we coordinate this, then when we have a more broader response, then we actually know where are all these assets. Currently, we don't even have a federal national register of where all these assets are distributed. So if we have a major response, how do we actually want to get specialized expertise, for instance, in the way, for instance, other federal countries do? Australia does have that capacity in state emergency services, and it is imperative on Canada to be able to build that capacity.
Thank you, appreciate it. Mr. Peterson, having just heard that answer in the sense of, for you to implement it, you mentioned your number one goal was the responsibility for capacity to build it. Why hasn't that happened?
Well, mainly lack of funding, I believe. We have been doing this on our own, and I believe many other communities are the same way. We saw a problem. We came up with solutions on our own. We tackled this on our own because we're so far up north. I mean, it took me 3 days to get here by aircraft and 6 days waiting for weather. So we get this job done on our own, really.
So what you're saying is you have the capacity to do it, you lack the resources to implement it, so use the tools that you've got at hand, whether it's a rock instead of a hammer. That's what you do.
We get the job done with the very little resources we have, and if we do have help, we can do a lot better. We can cut down the times. We can actually cut down searches, rescues, things like that.
When you talk about geared up, have there been lists of equipment identified and submitted and requested?
They have been identified, but I don't know about requested. But yeah, we have come up with a few things that would really benefit the searches, like I was mentioning, dry suits to be wearing right now. A hovercraft would be great. That would be capable of holding a stretcher and a few rescuers. You know, specialized equipment such as that would greatly affect the times and the results.
What does it go to the mentality of the volunteers when they know that kind of quality would be available, what they got now? What does it do to the mental state of people who know they have less equipment than could be? How does that affect them?
We get the job done one way or another. I mean, we have the tools. Well, we don't have the tools, sorry, and all we think about is let's go and find this person. We're not worried about what machine we're using or what gear we're using. All we're worried about is let's get there now, and let's find this person and bring them back home.
Thank you, Mr. Shields. Mr. Weiler.
Good question. Yeah, great questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and also to the witnesses for being here today and for your great testimony to this point. My first question is actually for Ms. Cardinal. So far in this study, we've heard from witnesses about how traditional practices are being followed with matters in wildfire risk management, such as in fuel management, and also doing emergency response plans that prioritize protection of certain culturally important areas. And you mentioned that as one of your first recommendation is embedding cultural safety into the design of your programs. And so I was hoping you could expand on what that means for the Canadian Red Cross.
Thank you for that question. When we look at cultural safety within the extensive work that we do across Canada and with many Indigenous communities, there's actually very specific elements that really help us to create greater cultural safety. One is, how do we be an ally in the best way that we possibly can? And so that is standing with community as opposed to as opposed to either standing over a community or making decisions for a community. One aspect of cultural safety that we realize is critical is understanding the reality within community, understanding historical harm, understanding the current challenges that community is actually facing. Over this past year, as there has been children discovered around residential schools, one of the things that we have found is that at times of natural disasters, where there has been environmental crisis in communities, where communities are also impacted by those social crises that are really coming forward, stress moves to distress quicker. That it just happens. Stress moves to distress quicker. So by us understanding what is actually happening with community, the barriers with community, when community is facing, just challenges, greater challenges around trauma and around different aspects of their history or imposed systems, things that really impose on culture, then it becomes more socially challenging for a community. And so there needs to be additional support. There needs to be additional mental health support. There needs to be additional psychosocial support. And that needs to be in a culturally attuned way, in a culturally aware way. Too often when it comes to programs or when it comes to response, there is often a space where the community has to become the educators to those that are helping with community challenge, and where community members are needing to educate when they're in a space of crisis, it just adds to the stress with community members. All of those things contribute in much greater ways to working in a culturally safe way.
Thank you for that. My next question I'd like to ask to Mr. Peterson, and first just to thank you for your service and the incredible amount of territory that you've covered, and I just have a great appreciation for the work that search and rescue volunteers do right across the country, oftentimes operating on a shoestring budget with, as you mentioned, challenges with equipment. And I'm just curious, could you please share with this committee how, you mentioned you had some support from some of the natural resource projects in the past. How has the equipment that you do have access to been funded to this point?
I'm guessing about 90% of the equipment has been purchased through fundraising by local efforts. Literally bingos, holding bingos and local fundraising events like that. We do get donations a couple of times a year from the local hamlet and from community members through radio, talk shows, that kind of thing during the Christmas. So most of it comes from the people, I think, and the natural resources, that's drying up. That mine has closed down, I think. So we are basically back to let's make the money on our own, just mostly fundraising.
Thanks for sharing that. And one of your recommendations you had was on setting up a roundtable with federal and territorial counterparts. I was wondering if you could just maybe share some light on what you would foresee such a process looking like.
Much like this one right here, I imagine a whole bunch of us sitting around a big table and sharing our ideas and thoughts about ways to reduce times, reduce actual searches, reduce rescues. I mean, like I said earlier, many heads equals many ideas, and if we can hash out all these things and come up with a bunch of solutions together, we will save more lives.
Thank you, Mr. Weiler. Madame Gill, vous avez 2 minutes et demie.
Madame Gill, you have 2.5 minutes. Thank you. I have a question for Mr. Thurston. Listening to you, I think that sovereignty and security and emergency preparedness is the responsibility of the Indigenous people themselves right now. Is it exact to say that, Mr. Peterson?
That's where we are. To get Southern help is hours and sometimes days away, like I was saying.
So you don't have any support. So you don't have support if you don't have the support for human resources, material resources. Everything is on your shoulder. What's worrying me in what you've said, you were talking about mental health issues. And I would imagine that you are also putting yourself at risk when you don't have adequate material. And I'm not sure if we're able to really be able to be calm when we're dealing with rescuing people that are our community members. So you've noted that there's much lacking from the help from government.
Yes, there is very little help, but we are very lucky in our community that we have a very small group of highly dedicated individuals that have come to learn on their own how to deal with this. But nobody should have to do that. I mean, just knowing these people that we are searching for, that we are recovering, is a huge burden. And to have someone just deal with it on their own, that takes a lot. There's only a few people on the world that can do this and function and continue to go to work and do their daily lives and, continue to search for these people. I give these guys a whole lot of credit.
And Mr. Peterson, I know that Mr. Leprecht spoke about combined forces. Is that something that could be useful also? Maybe it wouldn't be as quick as people who are there, but would it be a comfort to the peoples if there was, and I don't want to speak for Mr. Leprecht, but he was talking about integration and that there would be a more global response. Is that something that could help?
Oh, yes, it will help a lot, especially if we have this community public safety officer. That would be the one person that would be coordinating all of these separate entities. We don't have that right now. It's just like chaos, really. If we do have a huge rescue operation, it will be chaotic. And having this safety officer program would greatly reduce the times, the confusion, a lot of things. Like just going through one person, how could I say this? We need an orchestrator for the band, right? Is that a good example, I think?
Thank you. Thank you, Madame Gill.
Ms. Hidlout, you have 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. My last question to you, Calvin. You have created a better understanding of Inuit communities, especially Qulluqtuq. I know that you need further assistance and resources, perhaps from the federal government. I would like to know if the other Nunavut communities have the same challenges that you were talking about. Can you tell us a little more about how the other communities operate?
I was a part of search and rescue in Cambridge Bay and Qulluqtuq. I lived in both communities, and they're very similar. I imagine all other communities are just the same in the passion that these are our people. We need to save our people. No questions asked. Like, we do the job with very little help, very little resources, but we are all determined because we know these people. We live with them. We work with them every day. We travel with them. So the passion is there. Every community has these people like Jack I mentioned earlier. They're highly dedicated individuals that get nothing in return but the satisfaction that we saved a life today. They put a lot of time and hours into this, and yeah, every community has this special person, or lucky to have a few of them. So yeah, the passion is there for every community, I think, and the same across Inuit Nunangat.
Thank you. I believe I have a few more minutes.
We had been told through our briefing materials that there is an ability for Canadian Rangers, and I can't remember if it was also a search and rescue, or it was Canadian Rangers who they rent equipment, if you're a Canadian Ranger, you can, for operations, rent your own equipment to yourself because you've done an exercise. I wonder if that's sufficient for you to be a Canadian Ranger, whereas Canadian Rangers from the military, they are provided those equipment for them when they do exercises in the north. Do you think it's sufficient that you are able to rent your own equipment when you're being a Canadian Ranger?
That funding hasn't been updated for a long time. Since then, prices have obviously gone up across the globe on everything. It helps a lot, but I think it could use an increase. As the other option, I'm not sure if I'd be comfortable on a random snowmobile or a random boat. I mean, we have to travel a lot of miles, and I'd be way more comfortable on my own equipment because I know that equipment. I've traveled thousands of miles on it. I know the tendencies. And to have somebody go to an unknown location on a brand new piece of equipment, it's unsafe, really. So you're just creating more hazards. So I believe this current way of renting is sufficient, but it could use an increase in modernization with the times of inflation and stuff like that.
Thank you very much. That brings our panel to a close. I would really like to thank, on behalf of the committee, Professor Luprecht, as well as Ms. Sargent and Ms. Cardinal from the Red Cross. A special thank you to Mr. Peterson, who came from a very long way to get here today to give his testimony. We very much appreciate all of your opening remarks and answers to our questions that will help us with our study. So thank you very much on behalf of the committee. We'll suspend temporarily and get ready for panel number 2. Thank you. So, colleagues, I would ask you to regain your seats, please, and we'll start with panel number 2. On this panel, we have 2 guests. We have the Honourable Shane Thompson, Minister of Municipal and Community Affairs and Minister of the Environment and Natural Resources for the Northwest Territories. And we have arriving imminently Chief April Martel of the Katlodici First Nation, also of the Northwest Territories. So for Minister Thompson, you probably are aware of how we do this. We would like to give you opening remarks time for 5 minutes. And then hopefully Chief Martel will have arrived. She'll speak for 5 minutes, and then we'll get into questions. So if you are ready, we are ready to listen to you. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hopefully this will be 5 minutes. I want to take this opportunity to thank the Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs for the opportunity to discuss the challenges faced by our territory's government and our communities. My name is Shane Thompson. I was born and raised in Hay River Northwest Territories. I am the Government of Northwest Territories Minister of 3 portfolios: Environment and Natural Resources, Lands, Municipal and Community Affairs, and the Minister responsible for Youth. To help set the context for our conversation today, I want to briefly highlight some important points about the Northwest Territories. Northwest Territories is comprised of 33 communities with approximately 45,000 people living in an area that is approximately 13% of Canada's landmass. Over half of our population is Indigenous. Our 19 of the 33 communities are served by an all-season highway system, 10 are served by winter road only, and 4 are served by marine or air only. 25 of these communities are nearly 100% dependent on fossil fuel for electricity, and this is mostly diesel generation. The other 8 are on 2 isolated hydropower grids not connected to the North American power system. Our government is consensus-based one, and we have no political party system. Our cabinet is appointed by the members of the the Legislative Assembly. Community governments play a strong independent role in the territories, but still require investment, training, capacity building to ensure that our infrastructure meets the needs of our residents. As you've likely determined, our communities are remote and rural with significant geographic distances between them, with aging and limited infrastructure. Only through collaboration and understanding of the territorial operations reality do I believe we can position our communities to be more resilient in both the context of emergency preparedness and Arctic security. In relation to Arctic security, from the Northwest Territories perspective, Northern security is not just about robust military presence, it's also about building sovereignty, strong, resilient people and communities that show Canada's commitment to the region. I believe this is achieved through significant investment in critical infrastructure like roads, telecommunications, and energy. Our fundamental importance to us is how decisions are made. Decisions about the North must be made by Northerners. After all, Northerners have the biggest stake in a strong and a sustainable Arctic Canada. We are committed to working across borders with Indigenous Northerners to improve the economic, social, and cultural well-being of the Arctic region, and thus improving Canada's Arctic sovereignty and security. Related to strategic infrastructure, the Northwest Territories will require much of the basic infrastructure that already exists in southern jurisdictions to meet the needs of our residents, communities, and businesses. The lack of road, communication, and energy infrastructure results in a high cost of living and doing business, and a significant challenge identified by our communities. Industry erodes the potential for economic development. The Northwest Territories continues to do its own part to close the significant infrastructure gap. We have invested in all-season roads to our communities and resources, alternative energy projects, and a fiber line to some of our most remote communities near the Beaufort Sea. The most important investment are supported by Canada, but more is needed if we are going to truly address the gap between our remote communities and the rest of Canada. While the diamond mine industry in Northwest Territories is beginning to wind down, there are many mining and natural gas resource opportunities, include a sustainable critical mineral potential that could fuel the global green economy and support the growth of our communities and Arctic sovereignty. All this can support Arctic sovereignty by ensuring safe, reliable access to resources needed to support and build the economy. However, it needs to be done in a way that is balanced with environmental stewardship so that we can connect our communities and develop our critical resources. The strategic importance of the Arctic, particularly as the marine transportation route, has been increasing due to climate change. This is part because it has shown to be warm between 3 to 4 times faster than the global average. Our winter road systems are at risk as our climate continues to change. Ice roads only work when it's cold. This impacts everything from our construction season communities without year-round road access to ability to ship in and out of existing mines. Our remote communities must be equipped to predict, prepare for, and respond to climate change hazards such as an increase to flood, fire, extreme cold weather events, erosion along rivers in the Arctic coast, unpredictable ice condition, and permafrost thaw. We need to ensure our communities have the capacity and ability to respond quickly to emergency situations and manage a disaster. This can be done through many tools. However, we need to support our communities and our Indigenous governments to assist their decision-making abilities. Premiers and Indigenous leaders from across the 3 territories issued a pan-Northern leadership statement on climate change. This statement highlighted needs for investment in climate-resilient infrastructure, renewable and alternative secure energy systems, emergency preparedness, Northern research, knowledge, and capacity building, support health and wellness, and prevention of cultural identity and economic opportunities. A strong and collaborative relationship with Canada is critical to advance the priority of residents, communities, and Indigenous leadership. The Arctic and Northern Policy Framework is the roadmap to success in Canada's Arctic. It provides an opportunity for Canada to show leadership in asserting Arctic sovereignty by empowering and equipping communities to be both resilient and responsive in the changing international landscape. Through the Arctic and Northern Policy Framework, the federal government has already acknowledged a significant gap that must be filled in the quality of life experience between Northerners and the rest of Canada. Now, the impact of COVID-19 has opened these gaps wider. It is critical that Canada move forward with us and fund the implementation of this critical framework. No one government can resolve these issues alone, and we look forward to continued collaboration with all governments of levels of government. The Northwest Territories has seen increased severity and occurrence of natural disasters such as unprecedented floods both in 2021 and this year, which has caused life-threatening hardship for so many communities as well as residents live in them and the businesses who are still trying to recover from the impact of COVID-19. Northwest Territories is also facing increased risk, impact of forest fires, shoreline erosion, and permafrost degradation, which are impacting community infrastructure. With these challenges in mind, the territorial government has increased staffing in emergency management operations at both the territorial and regional level to support community governments in their emergency preparedness, planning, and response. With these increases of resources, the territorial and regional emergency management organizations are better equipped to increase engagement with community leadership, improve guidance, advice, and support to communities in advance of the disaster events. Communities remain the front line for emergency management, and they rely on the territorial government for support during the response and recovery efforts. And in return, must have the support and flexibility of the federal government and its funding programs in order to respond as quickly as possible to our residents in their time of greatest needs. Dedicated, flexible federal funding is needed to support mitigation efforts for communities' infrastructure, including relocation of critical municipal infrastructure, residents, and businesses and communities at the risk of disaster events. In conclusion, I'd like to say we look forward to the continued partnership and support of this government to meet the challenges I've laid out for you today. Northerners are resilient people, but they need the support and action at all levels of government to ensure their safety, their security, and their future. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. It looks like our second guest is not here yet, so we'll proceed immediately with questions, and I've got Mr. Schmale down for 6 minutes.
Perfect. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Minister, for your comments. I want to pick up on where you just left off, talking about emergency preparedness and the several aspects that encompass that file. You talked about emergency response plans. You talked about training. We can probably add in public awareness activities, equipment. The list goes on. So. Just to finish up your thought, I think, in your view, are there certain aspects of emergency preparedness that are more important than others in the Arctic? And if so, what are they and why?
That's a very loaded question, I would have to say. So I think it's all encompassing. Again, as I said in my opening comments, it's about making sure our communities are prepared. And what that means is that we need to be working with them so that they're prepared. So whether it's tabletop exercises, making sure their emergency response plans are in place, but then also making sure that residents, this year we started a campaign where telling people what people's responsibilities, when we start with the residents, what their responsibilities are, what communities' responsibilities are, what the government's responsibilities are, and in each department, and how we can all work together and collaboratively work together to address these emergencies that we're seeing. As I said in my opening or comments here, the last 2 years, the riding that I represent of the 6 communities, Jean Marie and Fort Simpson, we were prepared for a 100-year flood, but it was a 200-year flood. Same as with Hay River here. When it all happened, it was worse than the 63-year flood. And so that year, they talked about the 100-year flood, and what we were seeing was the impact of a 200-year flood. And as prepared as we were, we still had challenges that were out there that we did not foresee. And again, it's when we talk to our local leadership, we talk to our elders, people that have been around, both in the last year's flood and this year's, they didn't foresee this. They haven't not recorded history. So whether it's, and when I say recorded history, as it's passed down from generation to generation. So we do have infrastructure in place to be able to help move things. We have plans in place that, we have the airports, we have the ability to move people to different locations. And so airports are very important, and we do have those in place right now. So we do have resources there, but it's about making sure we enhance those resources. Hopefully that answers your question.
That did very well. Thank you. Thank you very much. In the previous testimony, we talked about the Canadian Rangers and the role they play in emergency preparedness. And I'd like to get your thoughts on how you think the federal government can continue to ensure that that is a resource that's available and well prepared.
Yeah, so we have a process where we reach out to the federal government if we need our rangers, if we need the military, if we need the Red Cross. So the system we have in place right now, it works well. Again, though, it's very much has to, I have to write a letter to the Minister of Safety and ask them for the Rangers, and we also have to work with DFN or Joint Task Force North and reach out to them. So we have a process of where we work with them. Again, the problem is that when we look at using our Rangers, they're great. They're very, very helpful, but sometimes when we access them, their communities are being impacted as well. And then we have rangers that are from other jurisdictions or other communities, but they're at the other end of the flood zone or the other end of the river. And so if we have to access them, then they may be taken out of being from in their community. So that is a challenge that we see. But again, I think we have a really good relationship with the federal government and the ability to access this if we need it. The resources are there. We used them, we utilized them more so last year than we did this year. And again, it depends on the resources in the communities and the ability of the communities to work on things. So I would say the Rangers are very integral part of what we do. Again, they're one part of the puzzle. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I guess on the comments you made about the emergencies you had, the comparison to the floods and the severity of it, the information you gathered from those events, are they continually used to update your plans and ensure that you are prepared as best you can for whatever scenarios on top?
Yes, like the thing is that from last year, we learned a lot from the disaster, some of the challenges. Like, I guess one of the things is, like you heard in my opening comments there, we noticed that there was this deficiency of having regional staff. We needed to have more staff at the regional level to help the communities out. So we created 5 positions. We also knew that we needed more positions at headquarters. So we created those 3 positions. Again, if you look at our communications that we developed, we started our communications again, it was weekly. I think we started in April, and we started weekly getting out to the communities, to the residents, to the governments, to Indigenous governments, getting them prepared. You know, this is what you're responsible for. This is what you're needing to do. We also helped us with the disaster assistance policy. We updated it and made it more compatible with the FAA, the federal government's disaster assistance policy. So what we found, and then the other thing is that we had pathfinders in, like last year, we didn't have them for probably 4 or 5 weeks. This time, as soon as it was safe, we had pathfinders in. We hired 3 more pathfinders to be living in the communities, that lived in the communities, so that they were able to help that way. So we learned from last year's flood, and again, what we did was, starting last year, is our plans are becoming living documents. And what that means is every year when we see there's new disasters, we try to improve it moving forward. So I would say our plans are getting better and better, but are they perfect? No. And what I mean by that is, if you think they're perfect, then that's when you're waiting for the next disaster to be unprepared for. So I think the departments, the communities have been very good at working together and enhancing their ability to address disasters, whether it's floods or forest fires. So I think, I believe that we are better prepared, but there's always Mother Nature throws a curve at you that you're never prepared for. So, but again, it's about the opportunity to learn. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schmale. We'll go to Mr. McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for joining us, Shane. In your 2 years as a minister, you've certainly seen your share of emergencies, especially when it comes to floods. And, it's quite concerning that we're starting to see floods happen in communities where we really didn't have the same level of flooding as before. And I appreciate your comment about seeing it, the 200-year flood levels being reached because, for example, the Hay River was developed with what they called a new town, which was not supposed to flood, and this year it flooded. And I'm quite concerned. We do have, as you stated, many communities without roads. We have many communities without police, and we have a lot more ships in the northern part of the territory, and we really don't have any navigational aid. So it's an accident waiting to happen. I'm not sure how we would handle it because the coastal communities out of larger boats. And the Rangers are good support. I belong to the Rangers. I was a master corporal with the Rangers. I volunteered to work with the junior Rangers, but I know that they don't have equipment. They don't have radios, so they can't talk to each other. They don't have air support. They don't have really a budget. And, the radios that the police use is not the same as what the fire department uses or the health center uses, or, there's no, the synchronization equipment is not there. And I think it's really important when disasters strike that it's critical that all levels of government know their roles and know their responsibilities, and that they maintain good communications between all levels of government and with the residents. My first question is, do you think that additional training opportunities and planning resources would help ensure that there's no confusion in these communities and have everybody on the same page, so to speak?
Thank you very much, Michael. Just a little history. Michael used to be my boss way back when, so he can smile. And yeah, so into regards to Michael's question here, training and resources are much needed. We do as much training as we can. We work with municipal governments. But again, in the Northwest Territories, like I said, I have 33 communities. 8 of them are designated authorities. We have 2 reserves. We have bands within and Métis locals within municipal governments. So again, the biggest challenge is to understand everybody's role and their ability to do things. What this last flood did, or the one in my riding did last year, was to show the importance of people working together. And what I found was the community of Fort Simpson, used that as an example. The band, the Métis, and the village got together. They worked on communication plan of who was responsible for what. Then it tapped into our EMO, regional EMO team, and using our superintendent. They did a tabletop exercises and that there. So we were able to have them to do it. But the biggest challenge is that when you look at what resources are needed, you only end up realizing what you need after the disaster happens. That's probably the biggest challenge that I've seen when I was I was impacted by the flood. I mean, my home didn't get hit, but the community that I lived in got hit pretty bad. And again, it was seeing the resources that we needed after the fact. In saying that, though, the government of the Northwest Territories and the federal government were very good, even with the COVID situation, of getting the resources that we needed. They were a little bit behind, but because, again, if you don't know what you need in the community at the time, it was not ready accessible. But as soon as we knew what we needed, like ENR was shower facilities and camp facilities, they were able to provide that. Same with the community of Jean Marie, whereas Fort and Hay River and the reserve, they had access to the road, so they were able to get out. Fort Simpson was landlocked, I guess, because the ferry wasn't in yet, and ice road or the ice bridge was taken out. So do we need more resources? Yes. But to say exactly what those resources are, again, would be very specific to the communities and seeing what their needs are. Thank you.
Just quickly, our communities in the north are quite young compared to the cities and towns in the south. Most of our communities have very little in terms of infrastructure. Some of it's fairly new. In the case of Fort Simpson and Jean Marie, for example, when the flood hit, the power supply was in the areas that got flooded, the sewer and water systems. So mitigation is going to be needed when it comes to relocating critical infrastructure, to building berms. Do you have any suggestions for the government on supporting infrastructure in northern and Indigenous communities that will help them mitigate the damage they may face from natural disasters?
Yeah, actually, thanks, Michael. Yeah, I have a number of ideas, but the most important thing is I think what the federal government needs to do is work with the territorial government to go into each community that are impacted and then talk to them. Like Fort Simpson, you may have seen in the news there, Michael, about the bank erosion, and it's getting closer and closer to the power plant and the health center. And so, what do we do? How are we going to mitigate this? How are we going to be able to do this? In the community of Tuck, the hamlet of Tuck, they figure in 2050 it's going to be completely underwater. And so how are we going to mitigate that? How are we going to move those? So each communities are going to be unique, how we do those things. I know in my conversations with the health minister, we were looking at, they're looking at replacing the health center in Fort Simpson, and the location that they were looking at, I told them, I said, maybe we shouldn't be looking at that. We should be maybe looking at moving our infrastructure up onto the hills. Same with our power plant, the new LNG plant that's coming into Fort Simpson. So some of those conversations got to be held. But again, the federal government needs to understand that there is going to be a huge impact on a number of communities, and we need to start looking at and working with the communities. I really need to stress that is the important aspect about it, is working with the communities. It's not about Big Brother coming in and saying, this is what you need to do. It's about everybody holding hands, working together to see what needs to be done. Like Jean Marie, do we need to move it further away from the Mackenzie River? Do we need to do that? I believe that there's a number of places and locations that need to be moved. I mean, you look at Hay River, I think you talked about that there. Newtown was supposed to stop the floods. And Riverview Drive, where I used to live in Hay River, was flooded. Where the ballpark used to be was flooded. So this is the reality is, how do we do that, and how do we move away from those difficult situations? So we need to work with the communities. And when I say communities, it's like in Hay River, it's the town, it's West Point, it's Caldici First Nation, it's the Métis. We need to work together to help them. And again, that's the federal government and territorial government and all people working together to make sure people are safe. So
thank you.
It is.
Thank you. We'll go to Madame Gill. Madame Gill, avez-vous la parole?
Madame Gill, you have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was listening and I thought that was very interesting what was being said by Minister Thompson. I think that when he's describing what they're experiencing, it's similar to what I've experienced in my riding too. We heard Madame Cardinal from the Red Cross, who was saying that Indigenous communities were those that would be the most affected by climate change crises, and that they were also the least prepared. I'm wondering if Minister Thompson agrees with this, and what can be done for these Indigenous communities. Thank you.
Thank you. I probably agree to disagree. I agree that it is having an impact on Indigenous governments. I mean, in the Northwest Territories, like I said, 3 to 4 times the national average, we're being impacted. We are living climate change. We are dealing with it. We are dealing with these issues. The one unique thing about the Northwest Territories, each community, if they're designated authorities, or if it's the reserve or it's the municipality, we work with them to train and give them the skills that we have in place. Each community has an emergency management plan in place. Some communities are better, have more staff and more resources. Some don't. But again, it's very much about each community has their own plan. We work with them. We don't designate or treat them differently. Like Jean Marie, which has 65 people, is no different than Fort Simpson, which has 1,250 people, or Hay River, which has 3,500 people. So, we treat everybody the same. We work on plans. Everybody has their own plans. And again, we do tabletop exercises, and we try to work and treat them as same as we can. But there is some unique challenges for Indigenous governments. it's more so about having the resources that each community, like Hay River, has more resources than Fort Simpson. Fort Simpson has more resources than Jean Marie. But again, and again, it's accessibility. Like Fort Simpson's, there's an ice road in Ferry that has an impact. Jean Marie has an all-season road. Hay River has an all-season road. So again, it's about location and the size of it, but we treat each community with the same respect that everybody should be treated. Thank you, Mr. Chair, or Madam Speaker.
Soyez rassurés, Ministre Thompson.
Minister Thompson, be reassured. I didn't mean that Indigenous people would be treated differently, but I was just saying what Madame Cardinal was saying, that some communities are lacking resources. But so it was the fact that tools were missing, but not what was being done by you and your government in the Northwest Territories, because the federal government, of course, can be of great help to you. I was also wanting to know, I thought it was interesting, you're saying that each of the communities have different realities. So do you think, to your knowledge, does the federal government have they had communication with all of the Indigenous communities to see what their needs were in terms of preparation materials and training and human resources? Do you know if anything has been done so far? Thank you.
So when we talk about training, and no, I didn't, first of all, I should say that there was no disrespect intended to my answer. I totally understood what your question was, and I greatly appreciate it. We're unique in the Northwest Territories because we actually work with our Indigenous governments. They, again, are very much about our role of how we work in there. And I will have to give a shout out to Michael McLeod because he's been very helpful bringing forth the Northwest Territories, whether it's the small communities or the cities' issues, to the federal government. But we do have the opportunity to work with CERNAC and Safety Canada.
But do the communities, were they individually consulted? You were talking about different communities, but I was wondering if these communities had been consulted by the federal government, if you have any knowledge, or if it was not done, the consultations.
I would say the consultation is through us as Municipal and Community Affairs. We are the lead. We work with them. We do reach out with the federal government through CERNAC and Safety Canada, and as well with the two reserves. We have a relationship that way. So I would say they're consulted through us. Thank you.
Do I have time left, Mr. Chair? You have 45 seconds. Well, maybe, Minister Thompson, so the consultation has happened, and you're saying that the federal government is aware of your needs through Mr. McLeod. Are there other requests that you would have if you were to be consulted? You have your plans in place, but what would be your recommendations? What do you think you could use as help from the federal government?
Quickly try to be real succinct. I would say more money, the ability to mitigate and adapt our communities, to understand that sometimes look at the disaster assistance policy to let us be a little bit for ability to work ahead of schedule. In other words, if we see a need to say, if we need camps in the community, the resources that we be able to access them before a disaster happens, so that the communities can have those resources, that would be very helpful.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madame Gill.
C'est Laut's turn, but she had to leave and has allocated her time to Mr. McLeod.
Thank you. Thank you again, Mr. Chair. I wanted to ask about search and rescue. I know we've been talking a lot about floods and the situation around how we're dealing with the challenges there, but search and rescue in the Northwest Territories is also an issue that needs attention, especially in light that, I think 3 years ago, before COVID hit, we had 33 vessels come through the Beaufort Sea. That's from large cruise ships to people in kayaks, and at some point, it's just a matter of time that we're going to have an accident because we don't have any navigation aids. We don't have all the mapping that's required. You know, people are going in there blind. I just wanted to ask you about response for search and rescue. Almost everything is located in the south. It takes sometimes a couple days to get a search plane if the weather's bad in Ontario. What would you suggest would be a solution to that? I mean, it's obvious that we should have something in the north, but I'll let you maybe speak to that a little bit more.
Thank you, Mr. McLeod, or MP McLeod. Yeah, I think that the resources should be closer. I would love to see something in Inuvik for the Beaufort Delta, especially with the climate change and the Beaufort Delta and the sea area there. But also having something in Yellowknife would be very beneficial as well. We do have. There used to be an army barracks in Inuvik, and it was taken away. But I think by having that resources in Inuvik would be able to help us in the northern part of the territories, but also would help the Yukon and a little bit of the Kitikmeot region as well. But also the same, I would love to see something in Yellowknife, the ability to expand the Joint Task North, to put some resources there that if we had the resources in these communities, then that'd be great. But also the other thing is to look at our airline companies and see how they could be accessed to be part of some search and rescue. Each of some of the regions have sort of like little smaller airline or charter companies that might be able to be accessible and work with them. So I think those are. First would be very much Inuvik and Yellowknife. I think would be very beneficial to us in the search and rescue, but also look at our charter airline companies. You know, in Fort Simpson, Yellowknife, or Hay River, Fort Simpson, and Inuvik. Thank you.
We talked about many things under the disasters, but the one area that seems to be lacking, and I have to give you a lot of credit, Shane, for all the upgrades and the work you've done in the area of support and the area of disaster assistance and information that is being put out there. But the one thing that is not clear to me, and I don't think most communities are able to really deal with when there's an evacuation, is the security of the community when everybody leaves. A lot of our small communities, we don't have RCMP, and a lot of times there's looting, there's people that stay behind, and they get into all kinds of mischief, and the leaders are asking for the rangers to come in or the military to come in. But in most cases, the rangers, I believe they're not allowed to do security. But what is the answer? What would you recommend the federal government put in place to help with that? And you know, it's not a really widespread problem, but it does exist. And
yeah, I totally agree. It's a unique situation. Because rangers are very much about certain things, militaries are certain things. I think it was you or one of the other members talked about we don't have RCMP in all their communities. So what we try to do sometimes, if we're able to get enforcement, which is our lands officers, our transportation officers, and our ENR officers, which help them be in the communities. But again, the level of the challenges is not as bad, and I hope it never is. But yeah, we utilize what exists. I don't know. I have an answer. Do we ask for the RCMP for more more members in there to get people from down south taken away from that, then yeah, I honestly don't know the answer. I would have to think about it and again, work with the communities on that as well. And just one comment, the disaster assistance, I would have to thank very much the staff. The Department of Municipal and Community Affairs staff have done an amazing job with us on this. I mean, an hour and a half every week they get drilled with me by asking questions. They think they're on the floor of the Legislative Assembly. So they've come up with a great approach to it. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Collègues,
Thank you, colleagues. We need to finish at 5:30. So I'd like to give Mr. Pawlowski 5 minutes, and then we will finish with 2.5 minutes.
Now, Mike probably hasn't been paying attention to his text, but Mike, do you want to keep asking questions? Because I know this is exactly your wheelhouse. I can, if you want.
Mr. Chairman, I do have a couple of questions. Thank you, Marcus. One more question for Mr. Thompson is around information as to what's out there in terms of programs, in terms of support. Many of our communities can't access insurance for disasters. A lot of our communities don't have the fire brigades, the fire support, the fire hydrants. So insurance companies are very reluctant to go into small Indigenous communities. And so, my office gets quite a few questions regarding how things work. Now, does the Minister Thompson feel that it's in order that the federal government work with different jurisdictions in terms of improving communications on how the federal programs like the disaster assistance works, how does the disaster mitigation work, and let people know, how to find their way through the process. I understand that the UNBT is putting together some positions so that they can help. But there's lots of concern. For example, in Hay River, we lost, I think we had 400 homes or 300 homes flooded. And so there's lots of people with question marks.
Yeah, I would say like there was 384 homes that were impacted that we had registered through a disaster. So again, any communication that we can get with the federal government, if they wish to share it with us or with the residents, that's great. When I say us, the Department of Municipal Community Affairs, again, more information we get out to residents, the better we are. I know that we share with the impacted MLAs, we share it with committee, we share it with the community leadership, and we have it with the Pathfinders, but more information we can get out to the residents, the impacted communities, the better off it is, so that better understanding of what the disaster assistance policy works from our end, but also from the federal government. And Michael is very correct in saying that, insurance is really hard to come by in some of these communities. And Michael described 2 scenarios perfectly. So yeah, it would be great to understand that and how we can help them get that information to people. That would be greatly appreciated.
Yeah, one more point I want to raise. I had wanted to ask this to Chief Martin, but my observations between the flood on the Cotlow-Ditchie Reserve and the town of Hay River, which are across the river from each other, I think the treatment was a little bit different in the case of the Cotlow-Ditchie. I visited both communities after the flood, and I was told on the reserve that they had a good team together, all local people, along with the chief as the lead, but there wasn't a lot of presence from anybody else. And in fact, the police were all concerned about Hay River, but the RCMP, there was nobody there, nobody on the reserve. The chief just about got caught up in the flood. The ice closed in on the road behind her. Several vehicles got in real dangerous predicaments, and if somebody didn't have the sense to jump in a loader and knock some of these big pieces of ice out of the way, we could have been a different ending to that situation. So What can you do, or what have you been doing to try to ensure that the Indigenous communities, the smaller communities, are treated the same as the larger regional center, so that agencies such as RSMP and in your own emergency measures people are treating everybody fairly?
Yeah, that there is a good, unique situation. I know from our department, we treat each Indigenous municipal government the same. Again, the resources, and sometimes, we're hearing some anecdotal information after the fact, and we will work with justice on it. We will work with other departments, other ministers. We do have meetings at the COC. We're in constant contact with the chief and the mayor of Hay River, and the situation you describe of Chief Martel, she told me about the same thing, and we're very fortunate she is around. That somebody jumped in on the loader and moved that ice and then pulled her vehicle out of the water. She was the second last person to leave that community. She was there to the very end, and I have to say Chief Martel did a great job. And again, it's about communications and how we work together. And again, we need to learn from this and be able to move forward. So, yeah, I've heard some of the challenges, and again, we're working on these issues to move forward to make sure we are able to, it doesn't happen again, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, this brings us to the end of our panel. I would like to thank, on behalf of the committee, Minister Thompson. Thank you very much for being with us this afternoon and patiently answering all our questions, especially the difficult ones from Mr. McLeod. So we're delighted that you were able to join us today. Unfortunately, we couldn't get Chief Martel, but you've provided some very valuable input to our study. Thank you very much. Avec tout ceci,
With that, we have now come to the end of our second panel for today, and we will now adjourn. Thank you.